Now, when did it just start for you? When did you get involved? Because I know, the incidents with the children of Daraa happened around 2012. So when did you and Sebastian start on this project?
Well, I think the Children of Daraa started 2011, March 2011. So we started looking at the war towards the end of 2014, and we started the project for real at the beginning of 2016.
So after Korangal.
Yeah.
Okay, so now, there's a lot to unpack here, obviously, when you talk about, the Syrian civil war, but why don't we start off with how it kicked off and just walk through it for people. But let's talk about the Children of Daraa, obviously, because that's the big incident that kind of sparked it for a lot of people. And, you mentioned in the documentary that the head of the security force there was the cousin of Bashar al-Assad, which I think had a little something to do with, that incident sort of exploding the way it did. But
well, there's lots of reasons why the protests became much bigger than they were. I think that you can look at the Turkish involvement throughout the Maghreb and the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's really distracting hearing yourself 2 seconds after you talk. So it's the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood's protest was suppressed very violently in the 80s. So you could look at these sort of flashpoints being exploited by a whole group of people. You could look at the Gulf states and the Americans saying, well, here's a flashpoint, we're going to start, as Flynn says, this is a conflagration, we're going to pour gasoline on the fire and see what happens, because our ultimate goal is to remove Bashar al-Assad. He was next. But he countered with, well, I'm going to militarize this situation.
Now, the film obviously it provides a really nice overview of the entire conflict, which I think is what it's most effective at. But I'm curious how you decided, as far as footage, to include, because there's a lot of violent footage in the documentary, and I've seen a lot of other Syria documentaries that don't provide such an unflinching look at the conflict, and I think that's a great thing about this documentary, is that it doesn't look away. But I was wondering if you could talk about, just the sort of responsibility there and how you decided to include the footage that you did.
Well, the footage, with the exception of the historical footage, the footage of the protests and the Battle of Aleppo, was basically commissioned by us, or there's some of the ISIS propaganda footage and the executions. Obviously, we found that with there was a footage repository that was sort of hidden. We found it in a Tor browser. So we decided that we were trying to paint as an accurate picture as possible. So we include the footage we did. Was the other films that revolve around Syria, not many actually infiltrated Syria or built a network of journalists or activists, and they certainly didn't do any frontline photography. So we spent a lot of time in Turkey. I spent a lot of time in Iraq, in Jordan. I think I haven't seen all the other films, so I can't really speak to them.
I've seen a lot of them, and you mentioned that. I think the great thing about this documentary is that, like you said, a lot of those documentaries are mostly just using other people's footage. And I think with Hell on Earth, why don't we just talk about the time you spent in these places and what you found while you were there?
Well, if you've seen Restrepo or any of our films, we try to find the humanity in the darkest places. So we're prepared to go to where the conflict is most poignant, which is generally the front line. So we want to know why people are fighting and what they're fighting for and how they're fighting. So that's sort of the style of it. We don't really make our films sitting in a comfortable edit room and hoping something comes nice over the Dropbox.
So where did you film exactly? You spent some time, you said, filming in Turkey and Iraq as well. I was wondering if we could talk about filming in Iraq in particular, and what sort of challenges that brought along?
Well, filming in Iraq has its challenges. I mean, the KRG is one thing, but we were lucky enough to have access to Golden Division, which is an Iraqi special forces. So we went with the Golden Division to Kiara. Kiara is a town to the south of Mosul. So we were basically the only it's really distracting, Western journalists that had access at that point. So when we walked into the town, they really hadn't seen Westerners for 2.5 years, and that was an oil refinery that had a lot of Westerners. So they were very used to it, but they were, as you could see, it's a very brief section of it, but we spent, a considerable time finding stories, Peshmerga stories, in KRG in Iraq. And I actually was arrested in Iraq for filming a pipeline in the south in Kirkuk.
Can we talk about that? I mean, what sort of happened with the arrest, and I mean, how close of a call was that for you guys?
Well, I was arrested by the Peshmerga, which is not such a bad thing. I mean, it was a little, I was filming a pipeline. I was a little close to probably where I shouldn't be. And then, 2 pickup trucks roll up, and then I'm like, oh. So that was a little tense, and then they take off your jacket, put the camera down, all the sort of standard stuff, and I couldn't quite work out who's who at this point, but I was pretty sure I was on the right side of the line you're meant to be on. And then they offered me a cigarette, and I was like, yes, cigarette, good, Peshmerga, yes.
Was that the closest call you guys had while filming?
I mean, that's not really a close call. That just resulted in a lot of tea drinking and trying to find, we played a bit of football. That's always good. I mean, that's not really a close call. I mean, I think that Carsten Stormer had a closer call with the Sinjar footage when he was interviewing. We followed a group of Marines who went to fight with Peshmerga, which they didn't really actually end up fighting anyone. But while they were doing an interview, a mortar landed maybe 20 yards for them and didn't explode. So that was pretty close.
Well, I'm glad you're here right now. I'm wondering if we could talk about Russia too, because that is obviously in the news a lot, and it comes up in the documentary towards the end, but it's obviously a very complicated situation when you talk about Russia's involvement in Syria, but I think the film did a good job of explaining a little bit about how, we've looked at maps of the airstrikes in Syria, and while Russia is saying one thing, that they're combating ISIS, they're really not doing that so much. They're really batting down, anti-Assad forces.
Well, yeah, they want to take out the middle ground and polarize it. But I don't think it's just the Russians. It was Hezbollah and the Iranians from the beginning that prevented the FSA and Haji Maura from taking Aleppo. I mean, that was the crucial intervention. Aleppo would have fallen without Hezbollah. And Hezbollah supported Assad because without the Assad regime, the Salafists are in Damascus, and they're 60 miles from Lebanon. Now,
there is a controversial person who pops up in this documentary, and I'm wondering if we could talk about Mike Flynn, who is in 2 scenes in the documentary, but I'm curious when you filmed that interview and why you decided to include it.
So we interviewed General Flynn March last year, and we include General Flynn because I think it's the last time he told the truth in public, and truly he's a very canny and wily person, but he's a little crazy. But he was telling the truth at this point, and we wanted that point of view in the film, and the fact that he's changed his opinion and the fact that he's flying in the face of what he then chose to do politically, I think is even more poignant.
Yeah, for those listening, he literally changed his opinion in September of 2016. So, I mean, let's talk a little bit more, too, about just the progression as well of the film. And let's talk about the family as well, because I think that is the heart of Hell on Earth. But how did you get in touch with this family, and how did they allow you to film them? You know, how did you make that relationship happen?
Well, the two families are the brothers of Adnan Mohammed, who is the archaeologist from the National Museum that we work with to expose antiquities dealings by the Islamic State. And he mentioned to us that his family had recently been displaced from Aleppo by the bombing, and that they were in Manbij, that was an ISIS town, and they were preparing to come to Turkey. And would you be interested in them filming that? And we were like, absolutely. So we managed to get them a camera, and which was a smartphone, a very good smartphone. But smartphones are, even in war zones, are pretty much ubiquitous. Everyone has a good phone now. And you taught them to hold it this way. We gave them this sort of this 2-page cheat sheet of like how to make a film. And they were just really good at it. So all the footage that you see in Syria, they shot themselves. And most of the footage you see, if you see 2 of them in the frame, in Turkey, I shot them because I picked them up in Osmaniye, and then I followed them to Izmir, and then followed them to the beach. But I couldn't get to the beach because the smugglers had these crazy dogs, and you just couldn't get any closer. So, but they basically documented their own journey. And what's interesting about, you know, someone like that documenting themselves is that other people's behavior don't change when you bring out a camera. A big white English guy brings out a camera, people start to behave differently. But if they bring out a smartphone, they could be in the detention center. I mean, after they were on the water, they were arrested, they were sent to a detention center for 7 days. You know, they could film without anyone being aware that they were filming for, you know, a bigger piece.
Now, I understand the French footage was a little bit controversial, right? Because the motorcycle footage, because I believe did that get the film banned in France? Or it can't show there, right?
We're currently discussing the legal options of releasing the film in France. I think that's the official position. Yeah, no, it's the only time you've ever seen jihad in first person. You've seen airplanes fly into buildings. You've seen, you know, security cam footage of bombings and suicide bombings. But this is the first time you see the cold and calculating, malevolent evilness of jihad.
Now, before we open it up to the audience, I just wanted to ask about, I mean, just the current administration in Syria. If we could talk about what they've done. Obviously, we saw President Trump's little sort of show of force with the 59 ballistic missiles aimed at the Syrian runway. But, I mean, how do you feel the Trump administration's been towards the Syria conflict? It's very complicated because obviously he's been cozying up to Russia, but also, you know, has vowed to defeat ISIS as well.
Well, I think that obviously the 59 missile strikes were completely ineffectual and were just you know, I don't know whether you can send missiles by tweeting yet, but it's pretty close. But what's actually will make a difference is the arming of the SDF in Rojava. So the SDF is a combination of Kurdish militias, whether it be the PKK, the YPG, which is the women's equivalent of the YPG. They have a equality concept in Kurdish culture where women are as equal as men. It doesn't quite work out perfectly, but there's a spirit of equality there. And so the arming of the FDF is very troublesome for the Turks, and the fact that there's currently a artillery battalion situated between the Turkish forces and the SDF, which are being armed by the Americans, is interesting. And the fact that the SDF are the best trained fighters in urban warfare. They've been fighting the Turks for years. If you look at the east of Turkey, it's been laid waste by the Turks. And that could be instrumental in the final push against the Islamic State in Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, and Deira.
There was also, I mean, this film is timelier than ever because there was a disturbing report released last week that said that, civilian casualties in Iraq and Syria were much higher than reported, at least as far as U.S.-caused civilian casualties.
The US are indiscriminate in their bombing campaigns. In fact, when we were in Chiara, we spent some time with Sheikh Nasser. We went with him to his village. It was the first time he'd been to his village in 2.5 years. We ate with him on the lawn that he grew up with and is surrounded by his buildings that had been completely destroyed. And there was he has a cadre of lieutenants and captains with him, and I'm just walking round the corner, and one guy goes, "You want to see the Sheikh's horse?" So he's like, he speaks English, so he was a trained fighter who was there to train the Sheikh's troops. We went and saw his horse, it was great. But Ali, who's his name, went to his village that was one village south with 20 fighters the day after the Sheikh's wedding, which was on the Saturday. And the Americans put a bomb on his head. 2,000 pounds, all 21 killed. The locals, even when they're fighting with the Allies or with the Kurds, are very scared of American airstrikes. They're much happy with the French. The French, they think, are super precise, but the Americans, big, dumb weapons, dropped from a great height.
Well, on that note, why don't we open it up to the audience if anyone has any questions? I believe there are people with microphones on either aisle. We'll give you one.
The focus was obviously on Syria, and the players were familiar with in this story, but the intelligence coming out of Europe is that Saudi Arabia and their Wahhabi conservative is also, did you feel any of the presence of that influence?
Sorry, the question being, do I feel the Wahhabist influence
In creating terrorists.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you look at Western, in Europe, there's been enormous influence from Wahhabist teachings. Wahhabism, Salafism, social pressure, poverty, inequality, that goes a long way to creating jihad. And it's the same thing in England, it's the same thing in Germany, it's the same thing in Spain. Absolutely. There's an absolutely direct correlation between the petrodollar propagated Wahhabist teachings in Europe and the level of jihad now. It was interesting to see the president doing the sword dance with Saudi Arabia and buying and selling them $110 billion worth of weapons too.
Well, that was after the $100 million donation to Ivanka and Jared's charity.
What has happened to the family that you featured in the film today?
The family, it lives in Izmir. They're doing okay. The kids are doing great. They're at school. They've opened a shop, and they're selling Syrian chutskis to the Syrian community there. So the Syrians eat slightly different than the Turks. The coffee's different, and they dress slightly differently. They're a little more colorful than the Turks. So they're doing okay.
Just to piggyback on that, though, are they saving up for another voyage to Greece?
No, I mean, the Greek camps have been turned into, basically, the islands themselves have become refugee camps. So instead of the walls of the camp being the walls, the edge of the water becomes their barrier. And once you get to those islands now, there's no, maybe you can get to Athens, but then you can't go further. So now the smugglers are they're taking small boats and sailing around Greece and landing in Italy. That's a $10,000 passage. That's only for the most wealthy.
I wanted to ask you about the progression of the film, the build of the film, and how you timelined it or sketched it out. One of the things I found so striking is I had dinner with a journalist recently, and they made the metaphor of the worst knot you could imagine in your child's hair in this situation in Syria and everyone else's involvement, the complexity of the involvement of everyone else. And I thought the way you built and progressed the narrative of the documentary worked really beautifully to slowly introduce and ease in these various characters and how complicated it was. One of the things that I noticed in particular, and was wonder if you were aware of as a filmmaker, was the gender, as ISIS starts building in your narratives, women sort of disappear in the film for a while, and then they sort of come back at the end. And I wondered if you had an awareness of that, or about the timeline and the progression of the film itself, how conscious a process that was.
Well, we always intended to make a film in 3 acts, so we were aware of the building the explaining the conflict, the rise of the FSA, the fall of the FSA, and then the subsequent power vacuum and the rise of the Islamic State. Then we sort of we thought about starting even further back and starting in Iraq, but that didn't work. So we kind of folded that into the rise of the Islamic State in the 2nd act. And the 3rd act is quite brief. We toyed with a more elongated 3rd act of, we bought footage of, which are basically ISIS instruction manuals of how to build homemade improvised devices, how to turn cars into, you can drive them by remote control with your phone or a walkie-talkie. And then we replicated these processes with a group of, in Colorado, that, an excellent group, Cubic. They're a group of, ex-ODA, ex-Green Beret, ex-SEALs, ex-Navy EOD. And basically we proved that anyone with a sort of Midas level mechanics understanding could turn a normal car into a remote controlled, VBED, a vehicle-borne IED. So we toyed with the idea, but it just becomes so depressing that these tools are available for anyone online or with a little bit of research or with a little bit of influence from the wrong people to cause this type of devastation. So we tried for this more hopeful ending. And I wasn't really aware of of women falling out in the middle of the film, but it's true, and I take your point, but women in the Islamic State are subjugated. So, and in Islam, not everywhere, but in terms of the oil or the taxation or the antiquities, or we didn't really bump into women at that point.
Why don't we just do 1 or 2 more? But
I just wanted to say first that your editorial choices were amazing. The imagery was beautiful, and it was knitted together with such facility. Focusing on a family and following a family through, I thought was particularly effective and affected me. And then overlaying that with major figures such as Obama and Putin and McCain and so on, I thought it made something extremely complex, nevertheless extremely accessible. Now, a question in my mind is this. We talked about the red line and Obama's refusal to cross it. Ultimately, he changed his mind. He didn't want to devote his entire administration to this particular issue, which is, he thought, what would happen. But in your view, could we have made a significant difference if we'd made a significant military commitment back then?
Well, it's hard to say. You can look at Libya and look at Syria as 2 case studies in the region and say, Libya, aggressive interventionist foreign policy, no-fly zone, support for the rebels, failed state. Syria, attempt to depose the Assad regime through supporting the FSA covertly through the CIA, then no action over no-fly zones or safe zones, and still have a even more pronounced failed state. So I think sometimes the inaction is more poignant than the action. So I would have hoped, I understand that this is a very complicated choice for the former president, but you know, no-fly zone. And then the other point is, so if you do introduce the no-fly zones, and at whose benefit is that? You may have seen the Assad regime fall, and you have a Salafist, you know, a successful Salafist uprising, and then what do you got? Then you really got a problem. So it's very complicated. I mean, I think some safe zones would have helped. I think some peacekeeping would have helped. I wish the Russians had been less intent on preserving their, you know, oil and gas monopoly to Europe and their warm weather port in Tartus and their airport in Latakia. But it's, you know, I think you needed some earlier, you know, what do you say, entente cordiale between Russia and the U.S.
All right, let's do last question. Anyone go?
Hi, you said that PKK and their associates are now fighting for the ISIS. Do you think that Shia and Sunni factor will play or affect their efforts?
Shia and Sunni, as in Iraqi Shia and Sunni, or as in like the Turks as well?
I'm meaning the Shia and Sunni from either Iraq
Hasti Shabi or?
So far as I'm concerned, we are only aware of the Shia and Sunni factors. So is it going to affect the PKK's efforts?
I mean, there is collaboration between the Iraqi army, Hashti Shabi, the Iraqi special police force, the anti-terrorism police force. And so there's a joint effort at the moment. So you can see Hashti Shabi and the Iraqi army fighting in Tal Afar, and you see the Iraqis fighting in Mosul. But I think they've drawn the line at the Iraqi army crossing the border into Syria. So I don't see that much. The Turks is a different story. The Turks are in the Turkish parliament to this day. There is a seat in the parliament that has Mosul written on it. So it is ultimately Erdogan's ambition to see, you know, at least free trade between Mosul and Istanbul. And he certainly wants to see no corridor across the southern Turkish border from Afrin to Rojava. I mean, they invaded there to deliberately stop there at Al-Bab and from Al-Bab to Kobani. So the Turks will never collaborate with the Kurds. That's their mortal enemy. Apo, you know, Öcalan has been in prison for 30 years and was kidnapped by the Turks in South Sudan, you know, 20 years ago.
Well, that's it. Thanks everybody for coming. And
I'll be outside if anyone wants to have any other questions.
And the film
Thank you so much for coming.
And the film premieres on National Geographic, I believe, June 11th.
June 11th, and if you want to mention it, we're on Facebook, #HellOnEarth. Thank you.
Thank you.